So we're going to get started here now. I'm going to introduce Dr. Beth Brady. She is our Senior Science and Conservation Associate here at Save the Manatee Club, and she focuses on manatee vocalizations. So, you want to go ahead?
All right. Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you all for joining us this evening about one of my favorite topics I love to talk about, which is manatee vocalizations. So let's dive right in. So one of the things that animals do in their environment, and there's multiple modalities that animals can use to communicate in their environment. They can use visual cues or acoustic cues, but the most common type of communication used in some contexts, particularly when you're in turbid habitats or forests, is acoustic communication. So one of the fundamental questions that researchers ask about looking at the communication of animals is, what kind of calls do they make and how do they use them when interacting with other animals? So to try and determine how many vocalizations or how many different types of calls animals might use, one of the things we look at is whether or not animals live in groups. So for example, in your upper left-hand corner, you have elephants. Elephants, for the most part, tend to live in groups, and they can produce between 8 to 15 different call types, depending on the author. And these call types are used to maintain group cohesion, express individuality, and maybe used in mating. Meerkats in your upper right, they're interesting. So they make at least 8 to 10 different call types, and that's just depending on the specific type of predator. So one call type for a specific predator. Down the lower left, you have a rhino. Rhinos tend to not live in groups, so they make approximately 3 call types. And what animals like this do is they normally make a few call types and they alter the structure of the sound depending on the behavior that they're engaged in. So when I'm talking about specific calls, we're talking about looking at calls on a spectrogram or a visual representation of sound. And this is what I'm showing you here. So what I'm showing you is a series of calls, and this is from one individual. And when we talk about call types, we talk about discrete or graded call types. So discrete call type is they don't really vary much. Imagine this call on the very far hand left of your screen, not changing no matter what the call or what the animal is doing. Then we have what's called graded call types, which is intermediary and can change a lot. So this animal, as it's approaching a food source, you can see the call type change. It goes from a tonal sound to merely noisy, chaotic sound. And these different call types can have different meanings. So basically it's one call type, but it just changes in structure just a little bit to give the call a little bit different meaning. So what about manatees? And what would manatees create? And what kind of call types would they create? So let's think about manatees and what kind of calls they would create and why they would create different call types. So do manatees live in groups? Well, in Florida, they aggregate at a warm water refuge. And those associations are usually temporary, right? Just during cold months. And even during summer months, they do aggregate in small groups. But again, these are normally very short-lived. What about predators like the meerkats? Do manatees have predators? Well, sharks and alligators sometimes when they're small can be a problem for manatees, but not really much of an issue for manatees when they're larger. What about moms and calves? Well, moms and calves tend to stay together for 1.5 to 2 years. So this would indicate to us that they may have some sounds that might be interesting and unique just to these individuals so that they can stay in contact with one another. Another interesting part to look at is the manatee brain. So this is really fascinating. So if you look at the visual cortex of the manatee up at the top of your screen, it's rather small. So manatees don't have really good vision. They don't have the fine spatial acuity that you and I do. They can see colors, blues and greens, but they're normally found in turbid environments. So their visual capabilities aren't maybe as important to them as some of their other senses. So look at the somatic sensory part. That's huge. So manatees have vibration concentrated on their face and on their back, where they think these might be used to detect changes in currents and temperatures, and maybe even other animals. But look at the auditory region. It is huge. Manatees have better hearing than we do. They hear from 500 hertz all the way up to 96 kilohertz. So they have phenomenal hearing, and a large part of their brain is devoted to hearing. So this would give us an indication that communication is quite important to manatees. So where do manatee vocalizations come from? How do manatees produce sound? Well, one of my fabulous colleagues actually did a study where she put a hydrophone or something that detects sound on the neck, thinking maybe there's vocal folds, or on the nose of a manatee. Sometimes when a manatee produces sound, you'll see some movement in the frontal part of its brain. And what she found was the sound, or most of the energy, was coming from the vocal or the vocal folds of the animal in the throat region. So what do we know about manatee vocalizations? Again, this is a spectrogram or a graphic representation of sound where you have time on your horizontal axis and frequency on your vertical axis. So this is what a typical manatee vocalization looks like. The fundamental frequency or the pitch, or like my voice would be the fundamental frequency or the sound that you're hearing. And it ranges between 2 to 5 kilohertz. If you were in the waters with a manatee, you could definitely hear them vocalizing. Whoops. Back up a sec. So the fundamental frequency there is the first band in a harmonic series, and I have that outlined for you in white. Then the dominant frequency band, usually where the most energy of the sound is concentrated, is the first harmonic, usually the first harmonic above the fundamental. And most calls have what's contained a harmonic structure, so what I have outlined in the band in there. And many calls have what we call frequency modulation or pitch modulation. What about cows and calves? Like we talked about before, cows and calves, would they have specific call types maybe that they would produce and use with each other? And what about as they age? So when calves are really small, they're about 50 to 60 pounds when they're born. So think about this. As a child, did your voice change from when you're a child to an adult? More than likely, yes, particularly if you're male. But what about a manatee? Do their calls change as they get older? And what about Sirenians in different geographic locations? So I bet you can tell the difference between someone who lives in Australia and someone who lives in the United States, right? We both speak English, but we both sound slightly different. What about even in the United States? People who live in Boston compared to here in Florida. We're both speaking English, but we both sound slightly different. So there are different species of sirenians. You have the West Indian manatee, now commonly called the American manatee, which is comprised of the Florida manatee and the Antillean, now known as the Greater Caribbean manatee. You have the Amazonian manatee and the African manatee. Would these vocalizations be different in these different geographic environments, or would they look the same? And last but not least, this is a drone image that we took over in Cape Canaveral Energy Center. How do manatees respond to each other? What do these calls that mean to each other? If I played one call to a manatee, would they care? What does it matter? Who would respond? So this led me to a lot of the questions that I have answered in my research. What is the manatee vocal repertoire? Are these calls associated with behavior? Do calls change with age? Are calls different between species? And how do manatees respond to the sounds of conspecifics? So the first one we'll talk about is the manatee vocal repertoire. So what do I use to record manatee vocalizations? And I use what's called a hydrophone or just an underwater microphone. And I'm showing you an image of the microphone that I used on the left and a setup that I commonly used on the right. So I put the electronic components that record the sound into a pelican case, attach the hydrophone to it, and put a buoy out in the water, which can stay in place for up to 24 hours to record manatee vocalizations in different habitats. So when I wanted to define their vocal repertoire, I went to a couple places where I knew manatees would aggregate or be in large numbers. So Crystal River is on the west coast of Florida. It's a freshwater outflow where manatees aggregate during winter months. Manatees are the infamous snowbirds. They don't tolerate waters lower than 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So they'll aggregate to these warm water refuges to stay warm. So Crystal River is one of them. Blue Springs is on the east coast of Florida, another freshwater refuge, warm water refuge where manatees come to stay warm. And then we have Portasueno Park on your bottom left. It's another freshwater outflow where manatees come during summer months to get fresh water to drink, and they're commonly seen there on a regular basis. So I put the hydrophones out there. You can see the hydrophone in the upper right, left it out for 48 to 72 hours in each of these locations. And I've had a lot of manatees in each of these locations. I had from 12 up to 120. So I recorded a lot of manatee vocalizations. And from that work, we defined 5 call categories. So we have the squeak, which is the most common call that manatees make on the left. We have the hill-shaped high squeak. We have a squeal, which is in the middle there, looks like a noisy, chaotic sound. A squeak squeal, which is a combination of a squeak and a squeal, and a chirp. And let me play some of these sounds for you. Probably not what you thought a manatee would sound like for being such a large creature, right? But they have what we call like high-pitched sounds. So this is great. I defined the vocal repertoire, but this doesn't necessarily mean that these calls are important to the animal. So one of the next steps you take is you look at the behavior of the animal. Do you see how they use each of these call types when interacting with other animals? Oh, one thing I forgot before that is manatees do vocalize into the ultrasonic frequency range. Remember I said their hearing is great. It goes up to 96 kilohertz, which is really high in the spectrum. So these are what recorded, some sounds that were recorded from a individual named Khaleesi, who was an Antillean manatee. And you can see those harmonics go into the ultrasonic frequency range or above 20 kilohertz. And they think these ultrasonic frequencies manatees use specifically for cows and calf to orient and to find one another. But back when I was talking about and to see those call types that I derived and how do we use them when they're interacting with conspecifics? Do they have a specific behavior in which each of these call types are used in? So how do you do this, right? So I went a couple of different locations. I went back to Portasueno Park, which is a freshwater outflow. I also went to Harbor Branch. It's what's called a passive thermal basin. It's an area that manatees use. The temperatures don't stay at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. They do fluctuate, but they are warm for a short period of time. Well, manatees will use this site during winter months. I also went to Crystal River. It was a place where they do health assessments every year. They do a little checkup on the manatees to make sure they're healthy. And I also went to Singer Island, an active feeding ground for manatees, and this was before the UME, where it still had ample seagrass. So what I wanted to look at is animals in different behavioral states. So you have resting. Manatees spend a lot of time resting, both at the surface, which is what you're seeing here, or they'll do what's called bottom resting, where they'll go to the bottom and they'll come up about every 6 to 12 minutes to take a couple of breaths, and they'll go back down to right where they were located previously. Feeding, manatees spend a lot of time feeding. So I wanted to know what calls do manatees make when they're feeding. We also have what's called cavorting, and I'll play this for you again. Cavorting is manatees that are playing and they're interacting with one another. You see a lot of rumbling and tumbling going around. And then we have stress. Remember I said manatees were captured up in Crystal River to do a health assessment or a health checkup on them. So I was in the water, and you can see me right here in the lower corner right here with my hydrophone. I was recording individuals as they were being captured and brought in on land to see what kind of sounds do manatees make when they're in really stressful environments. I also counted the number of animals. To determine behavior, you want to make sure the majority of your animals are engaged in a certain type of behavior. I also wanted to know the vocalizations vary depending on whether or not calves were present. So how do you know whether or not you have a calf? If you see here on the left-hand side, you see the calf in cow-calf position, meaning it's coming in right next to the mom, kind of about the side of the teat. On the right-hand side, you see nursing behavior. So some of these calves, they're really difficult to tell whether or not they're a subadult or adult. So I had to look for nursing behavior to see if the calf was nursing behind mom's teat. I also wanted to look for different changes. Remember those changes in structure? So I want you to think about your dog or your cat, right? Your dog barks or your cat meows. And I bet you can tell the difference between when your dog barks or meows. There might be slight changes in how they produce that bark or meow, and you probably know whether or not it wants to go out, whether it wants to play, whether it wants food. You can hear those slight changes in the way your dog barks or your cat meows. Well, that's a very similar thing that we see in science. We actually measure those changes. So what I wanted to know if vocalizations were different in a higher arousal or more elevated states such as stress or when they were playing. We would expect these call types to be more pitch modulated, as you would see in the second spectrogram right here. Or in a lower arousal state, maybe when they're resting or feeding, they're not really acting anymore with each other. Would they be more tonal or flat? So other things that I measured was duration. How long was the call? Frequency modulation here, like we think in the middle, like are they more pitch modulated? Do they change in frequency more when they're stressed or playing? And entropy of these noisy sounds right here. Entropy is just a measure of noise in a call. So when we're measuring entropy, some animals, maybe your dog, might growl or bark, and usually they have more chaos or more of this noisy sound in the call. So I wanted to know if that was in the calls as well. So what did we find? Well, out of those 5 call types I originally defined, we found 3 call types were really strongly represented in each of these populations. So squeaks, the one in the middle here, is the most common call type. And let me see if I can play this for you so you can hear specifically what squeaks sound like. High squeaks, whoops, there's more calls in there. High squeaks was the next dominant call type that I observed, and these were highly correlated with calf presence. There's more on this to come and more information on that, but I'm going to play what high squeak for you sounds right now. And then you have the squeal. This is the third most dominant call type. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about this and a little bit about what that call is specifically associated with. So just by listening, you probably don't hear much difference between a squeak and a hill-shaped high squeak. They really are hard to differentiate by the ear. But I'm thinking maybe you might have heard the difference in those squeal and those noisy sounding calls. Uh-oh, there we go. So what about resting? So manatees do spend a lot of time resting, and I love them because they rest in some really interesting positions. But again, we found the squeak call, the most predominant type of call, was produced when manatees were resting. And as expected, they were a lot more flat and more tonal in nature. What about manatees feeding? So here's a great video of manatees feeding. So they'll feed, this is not exactly seagrass, right? But sometimes manatees will feed or eat algae, particularly off this seawall. And this is some video that I got of them feeding. And here's some good sounds of manatees actually chewing on some grasses. Oops, that's not what I wanted. There you go. They definitely make a lot of noise when they're feeding. So as expected, we found a lot of squeaks during this behavior and very tonal-like calls. What about manatees that were playing? Here's another video of some manatees playing with one another. This is a little bit larger group, about 3 or 4 animals that were playing with one another. And as expected, these calls were a lot more pitch modulated, and you had a lot more of these noisy squeal type calls. So what does this mean? Does this mean that manatees are aggressive? Not necessarily, but they are playing. And when manatees are mating, they are competing for that female. So when you have a mating herd, you have one female with a group of males. So maybe potentially they're producing these sounds as an aggressive call so they can be closer to the female. More in that to come. But what about stressed call types? And these are really interesting. These are the most pitch modulated of them all, and they were the longest in duration. Try to think of being at a horror picture show when you get a good jump scare, and I bet your vocalization itself is going to be very long because you are scared. You probably scream fairly loud. Okay, so what about calls? Do calls change with age? And I want you to think about humans. Do our voices change with age? Absolutely. So what we're showing you here, and these are individual spectrograms from individuals that we recorded. So each of those individual spectrograms that you see, this one here, 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 and here. Those are from individual animals that we recorded in Florida. What I'm showing you at the top here is the length of this animal at the time of their recording in centimeters. And we recorded some of these animals in captive environments, namely Zoo Tampa, who were generous enough to allow us to record animals in their care there. So what you want to first notice is the hill-shaped high squeak call and starts to flatten out as it gets older. Same thing occurred with the Antillean manatee. So again, these are recorded from individual captive Antillean manatees. You can see the hill-shaped call, those high squeaks, starting to flatten out and become more like an adult type squeak as they age. So yeah, we did a study on this. We actually measured these differences. And long story short, here are those individual manatees again and the lengths of those animals. As the animal gets older, that hill-shaped call becomes an adult type high squeak. So why would this be important? So like I said, in Florida, manatees aggregate at some known locations. In other areas such as Africa, Mexico, all the Antillean and the African and the Amazonian manatees, they don't aggregate in these large numbers. They aggregate in very small numbers, if at all, and they cover really large geographic areas. So how would you know whether or not a manatee was present and whether or not the habitat that they are is important? So using underwater acoustics, you can not only know whether or not a manatee was there, and you can know whether or not you had a calf or an adult, which means you need to know if it was important for habitat for maybe cows and calves to give birth. Our call is different between species. So let's talk about the West Indian manatee. Now it's known as the American manatee. So you have a Florida manatee on the top and an Antillean manatee on the bottom. I want you to take a moment and notice and see if you see any differences between these species. So I'm going to just pause for a second. So what you might notice and what we know is the Antillean manatees, they look very similar to the Florida manatee. It'd be really difficult to tell them apart, but we do know the Antillean manatees are a little bit smaller in body size than the Florida manatee. So what we did for this study is we put hydrophones in 3 geographic locations. So we have them in Florida, we had them in St. George's Cay, Belize, and we had them in Panama. So we had hydrophones out in each of these 3 locations and recorded vocalizations for manatees in these 3 different habitats. So for Blue Springs, we had, again, about 120 animals. At St. George's Cay, you have approximately 50 animals. And in Panama Canal, you have about 40 animals that utilize the area. And then just to give you a general indication of how long we had to record to get some of these vocalizations. So Blue Springs, that was 16 hours because you have over 100 animals. In St. George's Cay, we had, I believe it was 300 hours to get a good number of vocalizations for the study. And in Panama, I believe it was over 600 hours, right? So manatees, but when they're by themselves, they normally don't vocalize a whole lot. They normally vocalize more frequently when they're in groups. So it could be happening that you have a manatee there that's not vocalized. It's going to take a very significant amount of hours to get the number of vocalizations to be able to do the analysis. So what we wanted to do is we measured parameters from each of these sites to see, do they produce the same call types and how do they differ? And do they differ? And to make a long story short, yes, so they produce very similar call types. They produce those 3 predominant call types that we saw, the squeal, the high squeak, and the squeak. But just like we talked about before and how people's voices can vary in different locations, the same thing varied here. So the animals from Florida were lowest in frequency or lowest in pitch. And the next highest in pitch was between animals in Panama. They were the next highest in frequency. And then Belize, which was highest in frequency. And does that really make sense? It's like, well, why would the Antillean manatees be different from one another and Florida be different? Well, it makes sense from Florida to be different than the Antillean species, but why the differences between Panama and Belize? So one of the things that we think might be different is, again, Florida's larger in body size. So that would make sense to us why it might be lower in frequency. But what about Panama and Belize? Why would it be different there? And one of our hypotheses is it might be due to the habitat. I want you to think about your voice when you're in a cave as opposed to when you're in a desert. Your voice is going to sound different depending on the habitat that you're in. quite possibly this might be the reason why these vocalizations are different in Panama and Belize. The animals in Panama have to navigate 4 different acoustic subhabitats. So they have a freshwater environment, they have a saltwater environment, they have a lagoon, they have different environments that they're being in, where Belize would just have primarily one habitat. And also in Belize, there's a lot of noise in the habitat. So another possibility is noise in the habitat, and sometimes animals will alter their vocalizations depending on a lot of noise in the habitat. So things that we still need into as why, but we do know that they're slightly different in frequency in these 3 different geographic locations. What about the Amazonian manatee? So let's look at the Amazonian manatee. You have the Amazonian manatee on your left and the Florida manatee on your right. I just want to have you look at those images just for a couple seconds to notice what the physical differences are between these 2 species. So one thing you might have noticed is the Amazonian manatee has that really unique pattern on its belly. The interesting thing about that is that it's individual. So each individual Amazonian manatee has a pattern that's unique to it to help identify. Amazonian manatees are the smallest of the manatee species, and they live primarily in fresh water, and they don't have fingernails. But what about Amazonian manatee vocalizations? What do they look like? So the first thing to note about Amazonian manatees is they are higher in frequency than Florida and Antillean manatees, where the Florida manatees are about 2 to 5 kilohertz. Amazonian manatees are about 6 to 8 kilohertz. And that makes sense. They're smaller in body size, which would mean it would be higher in frequency. I want you to think of an elephant and a mouse. A mouse would probably be more high-pitched in frequency than an elephant would be. But the other thing that we noticed about Amazonian manatee vocalizations is that they vocalize in what we call notes. So if you look here at this spectrogram on the right of a Florida manatee, they're kind of linear, they're straight, they don't really break in between. Here, the Amazonian manatee, it breaks a little bit. There's a little bit of break in between the calls themselves, and they call those notes. So why do they produce notes? Well, it could be more of an ontogeny thing for the Amazonian manatee. There was one study that was done by some colleagues who showed that they changed really slightly and produced more notes over time as they grew. So a possibility, but with only a sample size, I believe, of 1. There's still more research that needs to be done. What about the African manatee, right? So let's look at the African manatee. You have the African manatee on your left and the Florida manatee on your right. And I want you to look at that for just a minute and see if you can notice any differences between these 2 species. So if you look at the African manatee, it's hard to tell them apart, right? So the African manatee is a slightly less deflected rostrum, and its eyes are just slightly different. So for this study, this was conducted by some of my colleagues who live in Africa, and they did this in Lake Assa Wildlife Preserve. So manatees in Africa unfortunately have not been well studied, and we're starting to change. Some of my colleagues are starting to change that. So they had actually put hydrophones out in this location just to see would we be able to record manatees. So they put the hydrophone, I believe it was for a couple of days, and the short answer was yes. We recorded over, I think it was like 2,000 manatee vocalizations. And when you look at these vocalizations right here, they look extremely similar to manatee vocalizations, right? They are slightly different in frequency as well. For the calls that we could measure, they were around 3,000 kilohertz. Now, could this be because it's in a different geographic location? That could be one answer. Another variation is, well, who's making the call? Could you have adults? Adults are also obviously going to be lower in vocalization, right? Younger individuals might be higher in vocalization and higher in frequency. So that could be another potential reason why we might have these slight variations other than geographic. So another thought in what we saw with these African manatee vocalizations were most of these vocalizations occurred at night. So why, I want you to think about for a minute, why do you think these vocalizations might occur during the evening hours? Well, there's a couple of different explanations here. One of them is manatees are still hunted. So it is thought that manatees went into Lake Assa, and it is an area where they're able to feed. Maybe they went in there at night to avoid predation, but another from humans. And another reason is to go feed. Maybe manatees want to feed more at night. And this does seem very common. We actually did a study with Antillean manatees in 2 different sites. So this is at St. George's Cay again. We have site A and site B. And up the top of the map, you can see where they're generally located to one another. And these are 2 different, we call it microhabitats, or habitats that are really close to one another. So site A is closer to the island itself. It's where you get a lot of boat noise. Site B is more offshore. It's also a resting hole where manatees use during the daytime hours. So Antillean manatees will sometimes use resting holes during the day where they rest, and they might go to feeding areas at night. And what we are finding is there was a lot or more vocalizations occurring at these habitats at night. So what I'm showing you here in this graph is site A and site B, and the number of vocalizations related to clock hours. So this is 2400, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. And just like in Africa, we are getting a lot more vocalizations at night than we are during the day. So this is giving us an indication that manatees may be more crepuscular, maybe using more nighttime activities to go do foraging and maybe avoid predation by humans. Oops. So how do manatees respond to the sounds of conspecifics? What do these sounds mean? And Pytel, I mean, what would they mean to the manatee if I play these specific sounds to them? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up this video right here. So, oops, actually, I'm going to go back for 1 second so I can go to this slide because I forgot this slide here. So what we did is we wanted to play sounds to wild manatees in Belize. So this was the location where this little heart is, where we went, where we knew aggregations of Antillean manatees were, and we wanted to play sounds to them. So we played squeaks, we played squeals, and we played high squeaks, the 3 most dominant call types to aggregations of manatees. We wanted to know how they would behaviorally respond to calls of other animals. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set the stage for you. So we played these sounds from a kayak, and this is the imagery that we got from a drone. And I'm going to keep my cursor approximately where the animals are because it's really difficult to see on a small screen, but I'm going to keep my cursor right about where the manatees are. And I'm going to start right up here. There's 2 animals right here that are playing with one another. So what I'm going to do, this is going to play at 2 times the speed, so it goes a little bit faster. What we're playing at this time is the squeak call. We want to know if these animals that are interacting with each other are going to hear the sound and what they're going to do when they hear the sound. So they're up here. This is about when they're playing right here. So this is about the time when we start playing. It takes them a little bit for them to hear it, but they're still up there playing. Now they're starting to move. So here they are. So we played the sounds for about 1.5 minutes. And they are slowly starting to come and approach the kayak. You can see their mud trails. There they are right here. They're coming right up to the kayak. So every time we played the squeak sound, the animals approached our kayak. So this is telling us that animals, particularly manatees, are very interested when they hear the sounds of other individuals and they do investigate. Oops, let's get me out of here. There we go. We also played the high squeak sound. So that's a calf call. And when we played the calf call, on a few occasions, there were cow-calf pairs, and mom would come approach the speaker and then immediately turn around and go back to her calf. And interestingly, when we played the squeal type vocalization, the call type we think might be a slightly aggressive call, interestingly, no one approached the kayak. So it's giving us some general indication that that squeal type call may be a call that is potentially used in aggression, but we still need to do some more tests to finalize that. And with that, that is my introduction to Manatee vocalizations for you. And I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Yeah, so we have one question already. The question is, you have a software program to help differentiate the actual sounds recorded by the hydrophones?
Yeah, so I use Raven software. It's from Cornell University. It's the software that I use to view the acoustic recordings. And then what you do is you go in there and you can actually measure each of these calls, and then you do some fancy statistical analysis to see if there are differences between each of these calls. So another question I commonly get, and I didn't know if I didn't mention this, do manatees have individuality in their vocalizations? Meaning, can they tell the difference from one another? And the bottom line is yes, just like my voice is different than your voice, they do have differences in their vocalizations, and specifically important between mom and calf. So mom can recognize her calf and calf can recognize mom based on the differences, and there's slight differences in their vocalization, mostly to do with pitch, right? Just like my voice is different than your voice.
So we do have another question. What does manatee aggression look like other than calls?
So I don't know if I would call it aggression, but when they're trying to mate, they are pushing and shoving when they are interacting with one another. So is it aggression? Probably not where you term aggression, maybe we term agnostic, right? Or agonistic. That's not the right word. Agonistic. I said the wrong word. Apologies. But yeah, more like pushing and shoving. It's not considered outright aggression. However, there have been some occasions recorded in captive environments and once in the wild where manatees were slightly aggressive towards people when they were towards a researcher that interrupted mating her. That was in the wild. And in captivity, they can be pushing and shoving with each other in attempts to get to food. So they may have some tendencies to be more aggressive than we're actually aware of.
Do you play the sounds underwater or on top of the kayak?
I play the sounds underwater. So one of the things we had to do is make sure that the manatees heard the sound. So there was a lot of animals in that geographic location. So we had to look at how far will these sounds go. So manatee sounds will propagate or actually go about 100 meters distance in the water where they can't be really well heard anymore. But preferably manatees within 50 meters of where we were playing the sound should have been able to hear the sounds that were being played.
And then is the vocalization between male and females distinctly different?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So, yes, they can be slightly different in frequency, and we are working on revisions to a manuscript where we played male sounds and female sounds to captive male and female manatees that didn't show much of a difference. They didn't really respond more to whether or not it was male or female, which leads us to believe they're more intrigued by an animal making the sound more than anything.
And then do manatees change their calls when relocated or when they live in captivity?
Well, that's a really hard one. I don't know the answer to that question, but one of the thoughts that we have is maybe playing calls to manatees in captive environments, particularly to orphan calves, may help them acclimate when they get back out in the wild, but it's unclear. We don't really know if they change them when they're in captivity, particularly since they go in there since they were orphan calves. And sometimes we don't know what their calls were before they got into the captive environment.
And then does saltwater, freshwater, or brackish water have an effect on the sounds? And would different species have the same water conditions?
Potentially, yes. They can influence the call structure and sound. And that's something that we didn't do in our study when we looked at different geographic locations to see if the call types varied in those different habitats. But that is something that potentially could have an effect on the calls themselves.
And then what kind of sounds do they make when mating?
Ooh, so here's a really interesting one. I've only recorded mating on a couple of different occasions, and they're usually silent, which is interesting because, and my theory or hypothesis behind this is because usually you get one animal, one female with a bunch of animals. So they probably don't want to make sounds because they don't want to draw in any other competitors, is what my hypothesis is. But I'm not sure, but that would make sense why they're relatively quiet when they're mating.
Oh, we have so many good questions. Okay. Do the calls happen more at the surface or at the bottom?
So calls generally happen more so when they're in the bottom of the water column, because what happens if manatees produce sounds when they're near the surface, they bounce and reflect off the top of the water column and the bottom of the water column, and they tend to cancel each other out. Most of the time when you look at manatee vocalizations, they're not that really clear with the harmonic structure. Most of the time when we're looking for these, we only see one harmonic, and that's all we get, depending on how close the animal is to the hydrophone. So the closer the animal is, the more harmonics you get. The further the animal is away, that dominant energy band where most of the energy is, you only get one harmonic. And sometimes they have what's called detectors. So for the recordings that I did, I didn't have detection algorithms that went through and detected all those manatee vocalizations. I was the detector. And in some of those other recordings, particularly Antillean manatees, you only see like one harmonic band. So it's hard for automatic detection algorithms, which usually go through and pick out the calls for you. They don't really detect those really well. We're actually working on a study right now which looks at detecting manatee calls in different habitats. And we're actually finding it's a lot more difficult for automatic detectors to find manatee calls in noisier habitats, particularly if they're not have those full harmonic structure.
So do trackers have built-in hydrophones? And if not, do you think in the near future there will be hydrophones built in for study purposes?
I believe some of them do. They have called D tags, but I'm not sure if the individual trackers that they use for animals to track their movements on are used. I don't believe there's enough room for that in there, but they do have trackers that they have used called D tags, which my colleague Athena Reisick used. She would put D tags or something on them. It would follow an individual animal and they could record their vocalizations. It's something that might be useful in the future to track them as we go.
And then do we know if vocalizations are more learned or more innate?
Ooh, that's a great question, and something I'm working with some colleagues of mine to see if manatees can learn vocalization. So that's something that's coming up in the not too distant future, but a great question that we hope to answer.
And then has research been done to determine if the Antillean manatees are able to communicate with Florida manatees?
Hmm. There hasn't been, but I would assume so. So there's a hybrid species between the Amazonian and the Antillean manatee. So I would assume, since their calls are very similar to one another, that it wouldn't be an issue for them. It just differences in frequency. And since we do have Florida manatees that travel into like Mexico, Cuba, Bahamas, where there are Antillean manatees, I wouldn't think it would be an issue for them to communicate with each other.
And then in regards to the research you're talking about, what did the manatees do after reaching the kayak?
Oh, well, here's a good story for you. So when we were doing these, I initially had the playing for like over 2 minutes, and when they came very close to the kayak, particularly manatees can flip kayaks, so I turned the sound off, which is why we played for a minute and a half. But after that, they turned away from the kayak. They kind of sat there for a minute and then turned away. So luckily, nothing happened, but that was bad. They didn't flip the kayak with the important electronic equipment in it.
And then someone would like to know, did you discover anything that was surprising to you?
Hmm. I don't know. I think surprising. I mean, I honestly I didn't think that the different species would have different frequency vocalizations. I mean, it was interesting that I knew they used the same type of vocalizations, but I didn't think they would vary so much in their frequency, which was really interesting.
And then, do manatees make any distress calls?
So that's the cool parts. Remember, I talked about the dog and the cat and how they make the same call type. They just vary the structure depending on the behavior they're engaged in. So when they're stressed, they still make that squeak call, right? That's the predominant call type that manatees make. Whether they're resting, sleeping, playing, or stressed, they make that squeak call. And the squeak calls were a lot more pitch modulated and they were a lot longer in duration. So they produce the same call type, even though stressful situations, they just make the call look slightly different. Like I said, more pitch modulated and a lot longer in duration. So not necessarily what we call a distress call, because that would be a different and distinct call type. But unfortunately, that's not what manatees are doing.
The next question is, do they communicate with each other?
Absolutely. They're very vocal with each other. What they're saying, kind of hard to say at this point. So what you would need to do is you need to put out multiple hydrophones and localize to individuals. And that way you say, okay, this animal made this sound. This one responded with this sound, right? What does it mean? How do they use call types when they're interacting with each other? So that's down the road and down the line, and something we were trying to at least start the middle investigations by doing the playbacks with wild animals to see, one, do these calls in and itself draw each other animal in? And then the short answer is yes, they definitely are drawn in by sounds of other individuals.
And then, so dolphins and whales may have names for each other, unique sounds for individuals. Manatees aren't super social, but is there any evidence for individual names or calls?
So there is individuality in their vocalizations. Do they use them to identify each other? It's possible. It's definitely possible. I can't rule it out 100%, but it's hard to say since their aggregations are really short-lived and for hours at a time. So potentially, yes, really important for cows and calves. Unclear if how much it goes beyond that.
And then as they get to late stages of life, like elderly, do their calls change?
From the research that's been done and not done by me, it looks like they become stable after a period of time. Usually when they get to that adult type stage and they reach a certain length, I believe that they stay stable for a period of time. I believe there's one animal that recorded, forget her name off the top of my head, who did the work, but she recorded an animal like 10 years apart and her call was stable for that length of time. They were very similar frequencies between those 10-year time frame.
And then what is a safe way to kayak in a manatee habitat, and when is mating season?
So mating season can be year round. However, it mostly happens during spring months. If you're in a kayak, you want to stay at least 2 kayak lengths away from manatee at a minimum. The best thing you do is take your paddle out of the water and just kind of float, right? Manatees sometimes are curious, sometimes they'll come investigate, but you don't ever want to reach out or try and interact with those animals. You just let them be manatees.
So this is a really great question. How does motorboat traffic affect manatee vocalizations?
Ooh, so that's a good one. So some of that work was done by Athena Rysick and Jennifer Mixis Olds, who looked at, from what I've seen, manatees don't vocalize when there's noise. They stop vocalizing. Jennifer Mixis Olds, I believe she found that they changed some of the structure of their calls a little bit, but what I've noticed is they don't vocalize as much. They decrease their number of vocalizations. So we did a study looking at tourism in Mexico, and we had some animals there and we put hydrophones out, and when there was noise and there's a lot of boat noise, animals were not vocalizing. But that's just preliminary. There's still a lot more work that needs to be done.
Did you encounter any other animals like dolphins making sounds that hindered you hearing the manatees?
Very rarely. I did have a dolphin once in a while, and then when the dolphins came in, the manatees again got quiet, which was very interesting. But you also get a lot of fish sounds, a lot of snapping shrimp sounds, and it doesn't seem like those hinder manatees at all in any way, shape, or form. I think the dolphin was the most interesting one. When they came in and the manatee got quiet and didn't speak. But that's the only occasion that I had.
Um, this is from the same person, actually. Her name is Michelle. She said, "Are you taking interns or volunteers to help with your research?"
We always can use interns and volunteers. I work with a colleague, the name of Eric Angel Ramos, and we always are getting large volumes of acoustic data. Like I said, those automatic detectors don't catch all the vocalizations, and we need people to go through and verify vocalizations and find the ones that the detectors don't. So, yes, always.
You can email us at education@savethemanatee.org and we'll connect you.
Certainly.
And we'll put that in the chat as well. If anyone also, if you have follow-up questions, again, you can feel free to email us if you think of something after as well. So do manatees vocalize to other species like alligators or humans?
I have no idea. I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I don't know. I've never known them. I've only seen them vocalize around other manatees, but that doesn't mean that doesn't happen or occur. I'm not sure at all.
And then what was your favorite part of this study?
My goodness, watching those animals. If you saw where I was at in a lot of those occasions, I was between me and like within 5 feet of manatees, and being able to watch them all the time was amazing. And just getting to be in close proximity to them, I really enjoyed that, doing all the work. So I can also listen to them live. So one of the things I didn't tell you is I would watch these animals and I could have little earbuds, right? So I would listen to them vocalizing and listen to all the sounds. A lot of people, or when they'd come and visit the site, because Portofino Park is a public site where people can come and watch the manatees. And I would let people listen to the manatees as they were vocalizing. And people are usually really enthralled by that and excited to hear what they were sounding as they were playing and interacting with one another.
Do you think that learning and understanding sounds more thoroughly will help in indicating in advance if something is wrong with manatees or their environment?
Possibly. It's a really good question. I always would think if there's no manatees in a habitat, and it doesn't mean that they're not physically there. Sometimes manatees, when they're by themselves, they don't vocalize a lot. The larger the group, the more vocalizations you're going to have. But if you're in a habitat where where you would expect to find manatees and don't find any, I guess then you want to start asking yourself the question, why aren't they there? Case in point, if we were over in the Indian River Lagoon and putting out hydrophones and weren't finding manatees in some of that really rich habitat, I guess I would ask myself why they aren't there. Right? Possibility. It's how I would indicate whether or not manatees are present, what habitat is important to them.
And then, do we know what the vocalization between mom and calf may be about?
Ooh, yeah. So when you get those really small calves and that hill shape call that I saw, that's what we call a stereotypical call. That call shape does not change until it's about 1 year of age. So no matter whether that's calves playing or it's stressed or it's feeding, it's always going to be that hill shaped call. So mom will have her stereotypical call, or the call that she's going to use. Remember, that probably doesn't change a whole lot. So they're going to hone in on different aspects of the call. For mom, they'll probably hone in on the frequency or the pitch. And for the calf, what the calf will do, they have specific differences in each calf. So that's how she identifies her calf from another calf. So there were some playback studies done by a colleague of mine, Renata Susan Lima, who played calf sounds to the mom, basically her calf, and then another unknown calf. And the mom responded to the sounds of her calf as opposed to the unknown calf. So there are some individual variations in there that the mom is picking up on. So she knows that her calf is there, and the calf can probably more likely do that for the mom as well.
And then, so this question is kind of about manatees and their relationship with other animals. Do they rely on any other animals in their environment to help with their survival?
Not that I am aware of.
And then, oh, someone said, I heard that manatees can express fear and anger through vocalizations. Which one do they tend to express the most?
So I would think, particularly if you're going to be in a habitat with a lot of boats and a lot of noise, I would think stress might be the one that they would probably do the most if I were to make an educated guess. Again, those call types would probably be a lot longer and a lot more pitch modulated, and that would make sense to me. But hard to say unless I was recording manatees 24 hours a day, which I'd love to do. It'd be great.
Do we know if they make any additional sounds that our equipment or human ears cannot register?
So their harmonics go into the ultrasonic frequency range. So I don't know of any other calls that they would make that would be outside of that frequency range. I mean, characterizing and categorizing calls is somewhat of a subjective process, right? So someone else might go behind me and do another study and find more call types than I did. It's possibility. Like I said, for elephants, depending on the author, you can have 8 to 15 call types. So someone might come behind me and define a different call type. So is it possible that there's more? It's possible there's more, but it's more of a subjective thing rather than maybe what's important to the animal.
Um, so I'm going to link these next two together because they're kind of about habitats. So
Sure.
it's kind of like, does the call change if the habitat changes? And then related to that, so thinking about human-made habitats, how does that influence?
So it's hard to say. Unfortunately, we haven't done the studies to see how these call types would change in the different habitats. One of the things that we are aware of is how the sound propagates in different habitats. So depending on how shallow the water is, how if it's composed of mud or clay, your sound is going to propagate differently in those different habitats, and potentially the frequency will change. And that's what we've seen with these different animals is in different geographic locations, is their call types differ in frequency. How specifically they change with those specific different habitat parameters, we still need to do the research to see those specific changes. So it's unclear, but it does seem like the habitat does definitely play a role. But what those specific changes are is unclear at this time.
That looks like all of the questions. It kind of calmed down. And I know we are approaching 7 o'clock here. Here in Florida. So yeah, again, if you have any questions following this, feel free to email us. We thank you so, so much for being here today, and thank you to Dr. Beth Brady for um, giving this wonderful presentation and answering so many great questions.
You guys had a lot
Again,
of really good questions. Thank you.
yeah, you can keep an eye on our webinars page. There's also past recordings from previous webinars as well. And then in November, we'll be doing another webinar on our Blue Springs research. So that'll be exciting. Thank you all again and have a great night.
Thank you. Have a great night.